Let's talk tariffs. This just happened. It's obviously impacting the market right now. Just the announcement for anyone that isn't up to speed on what happened in the last hour. There was a news report out of the Wall Street Journal earlier today saying the tariffs on Canada and Mexico had been postponed to the end of March. People took this as, oh yeah, it's a negotiating tactic. We have nothing to worry about. This is like the second time this has happened in like a month where the Wall Street Journal runs something like this. And then the Trump White House comes out and says, no, that's wrong. Your source doesn't know what they're talking about. So then they come out and contradict it and say 25% tariffs, Canada and Mexico tomorrow, and 10% China tomorrow.
Justin Trudeau has signaled that his administration will retaliate Trump's tariffs if he imposes them tomorrow. Trade war, here we come. It looks like he's already out on national television in Canada to respond to these tariffs.
A similar thing happened with DeepSeek. The DeepSeek model launched 4 weeks before the market had a reaction to it. It's honestly a little surprising to me because I thought the market had already digested that news. And it was a similar thing with this tariff news. Like it's apparent from positioning that the market didn't really believe Trump. They didn't really believe that he was going to do this. He didn't really believe that he was going to implement these tariffs. And so you got a bit of a surprise when they did. Now, I'm going to be honest, it isn't that big of a move. So, that might also explain some of it. But it definitely people are, I think, coming to face with that he's serious with the tariff policy. Now, does that mean that like concessions can't be made with Canada? Does that mean that people can't come to terms and those can't get rolled back? Of course not. And that probably will happen in some way at some point. But it also wouldn't surprise me to see a global baseline tariff, maybe 5% or 10% that the US does put in.
I'm in the camp that these will at least partially be used as a negotiating tool for certain ends for the Trump administration. And one of the things that Reuters is reporting on, again, this is very new news. So outlets are just responding to it. Markets are just responding to it. And it takes time for people to digest this. But one of the things they said was that actions to curb fentanyl trade and illegal immigration may earn a reprieve from these tariffs. So I think if anyone thinks, tariffs are slapped on, that now they're on for the next 4 years, like it's a lot more complicated than that.
100%. It has a clear fentanyl target. And so some people were a little confused. I have a friend of mine who was he actually put on a lot of positioning in financial markets that they would not get applied to Canada. And his reasoning was like, it doesn't make sense. Canada isn't a fentanyl issue. Going back and forth with him, I ended up doing some research on this. And so the challenge is that international kind of crime syndicates have been increasingly rotating to Canada, and that it also serves as a shipping location for precursor chemicals. Now, the question that's up in the air is how big is that really? It's certainly not as big of a problem as Mexico. That's where most of it's coming from. And so there's some confusion here, but it does seem like the Trump White House is looking for something related to fentanyl cooperation.
I got to assume Canada is just to get another state for us more than fentanyl.
Yeah, but like, he's still talking about that. It's like you can dodge the tariffs if you become a state. Plus, you don't have to worry about military. Plus, you'll get massive tax cuts because you're way overly taxed in Canada. He's just still, that was a week ago. I saw him on a press conference say that, but he's making good on his word. However you feel about that word.
Yes, slight tangent here. My thought on the future is that if we're going to get off of China a little bit as our manufacturing base, Vietnam, Bangladesh, etc., and move it closer, let's say Mexico, I think we want to have Mexico economically benefit in a huge way over this next decade and consider them our low-cost manufacturing partner. And yeah, I think priority one in the short term is get the border under control. But I do not want to see a world where we're super antagonistic with Mexico. That's a world where our prices go way up as individual consumers in the US. Whereas if we manufacture most things in Mexico, we might have this thing where Mexico's middle class goes up, the border is secure, and we still maintain relatively low increases in goods.
Yeah, I'm with you 100% on that. I agree fully. I think a stronger manufacturing relationship between the US and Mexico is extremely beneficial. But what has to precede that is the gangs. The gangs have to be handled, and that's what comes first. And it's been a challenging situation where we've not been able to make much progress. And I think some of this hardline approach is saying, hey, it's time to get the cartels under control. And so we'll see, because if you can clean that up, then we can have a very prosperous relationship with Mexico.
25% tariffs on imports from Canada and Mexico, and 10% tariffs on goods from China, effective on Saturday.
Yeah.
There you go.
Bitcoin reacted to the S&P news. Bitcoin, the thing to understand, people, is that people own a portfolio of assets, right? Like most people, they're not like 100% in Bitcoin. They have some Bitcoin, though. Not most people have some Bitcoin, but of people who do hold Bitcoin, for most of those people, it's a percentage. And so let's say you're 80% in index funds, US stocks, and you got 20% Bitcoin. If you get spooked, right? You see the tariff news, you're like, oh my God, I didn't think he was really going to do it. And this could be bad. There's fears that it'll be bad for the stock market. You start trimming your positions. I could obviously sell down some index funds, but maybe Bitcoin's more volatile. I'm going to sell some of that too. Anyway, so it's not a critique that it trades together. It just signifies that people, they own it with other assets. And when they get surprised, they take a defensive posture. So Bitcoin traded down on that. That's what happened. Looking at the S&P right now, it's basically flat on the day. It's literally about to be exactly where it opened up. Now, it was up 0.8%. It is down 0.8% from the news, but it's already recovering and it's going back to, it'll be green shortly. So it's not too extreme of a response. And as always, Bitcoin's a little trigger happy, and that might be because people are levered up.
Just one more quick comment on this one. I think it's important for everyone to remember that the starting point here, it's not perfectly free, no tariff trade. There are a bunch of tariffs in place between the US and other countries in both directions already.
Yeah.
And just a real quick anecdote. Years ago, my prior career, when I was still at Goldman Sachs, we had a meeting. It was when Trump was first taking office. And people were basically saying to this external speaker who had more insight into tariffs than we did. And they said to him, they were like, all these agreements, they're called free trade agreements. But then when you look behind the cover sheet of the free trade agreement, it's like tariffs everywhere. And they call it a free trade agreement, but it's basically them just agreeing on what tariffs they're going to charge each other. So it's a very misleading name. Like, we don't really have this concept of very free trade. It's like negotiated trade. So I just would want everyone to remember that tariffs already exist. Trump is maybe taking it to another level for sure. But just remember that that's what the starting point is here.
I'm going to look this up specifically and get the numbers. It should be interesting. But I agree with you 100%. And we've had tariffs. Trump put tariffs in place in his first term that have stayed the whole time and didn't. The fear is that it'll increase inflation. It didn't increase inflation. It raised revenue. And the interesting thing is there's some people that are against tariffs because it's an economic distortion. Oh, you're like putting this false pressure on the market. So is literally every other tax and every other
government action.
Yeah,
There's no free market. Like, it's never had a free market ever in the history of the world.
Income tax is that. You can't like hate one and not the other. If you want to say, hey, yeah, the government shouldn't put its hand on anything, sure, that's obviously on a market's perspective going to be optimal. Whether the government wants to raise revenue via tariffs or via income tax, or
I mean, Jeff Booth is saying that we are in the beginning of the first ever actual free trade era in the history of humanity right now, because we have a money that cannot be corrupted by human beings. That interference with the money is, by definition, interference with the market.
The other side of the protectionist argument, which is that tariffs, essentially, if we allow globalism and free trade entirely in the world, it's the manufacturers are going to use the lowest cost labor, which means all of our jobs leave and they consolidate and they hop around to low cost labor. You drag those countries out of poverty, but you give up our local jobs. So we get cheap goods and we lose our jobs. And so there is an argument for protectionism here. It does distort markets, but at a certain point, America should be looking out for America. And I think that's part of the equation here.
It's part of the equation.
So in the EU, we pay an average tariff. This is the US selling goods to other countries. It's like what we're trying to do to other countries. This is what's been done to us. average tariff rate of 5% for whatever we bring over to the EU, up to a 10% tariff on cars, on agricultural products, significantly higher. In China, we're paying 7.5% to send goods over there. China does a 15% tariff on our cars, meat products up to 20% or higher. Japan, 4%, South Korea, 13.7%. India, our average tariff rate is 17.1%. Brazil, 13.4%. Now, what is notable here is that Canada and Mexico are mostly tariff free. So this is a change of the Canada and Mexico relationship. But I think it is really helpful to see those numbers that other countries are doing this to us already. This is not like this unheard of practice that is uncommon in the world today. There are a ton of these in place.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe this is the last vestiges of NAFTA, which was a Clinton administration initiative back in the 90s.